A reading from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 1 to 12, the resurrection of Jesus. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened.
Every now and then, because of my son-in-law, I tried to read and think a little bit about things scientific. He's been talking to me about gravitational waves, and they make absolutely no sense whatsoever. I'm sure they make sense to some of you, but for me it's a bit of a trouble. I also have a son who has been, but not so much now, a mad science fiction aficionado, and he has bookshelves filled with science fiction books and particular magazines. And it made me think, for as long as we humans have been looking at the stars, we've been wondering if there is life on any distant planet. And in our imagination, we picture distant worlds, and if you have watched some of the movies and things that come along, distant worlds where aliens exist. Aliens in the first place who look very much like us, or aliens who look very much unlike us. They are creatures whom perhaps we might one day get to know, or if a lot of science fiction is correct, may one day be those creatures from whom we run screaming as far away as we can get. There is some new technology which has been taking place over the last couple of years, and there is an item called a Kepler Space Telescope. Now, astronomers have been looking deeper and deeper into space for more signs of potentially habitable, perhaps life-sustaining planets that look somewhat like our own. And recently they found such a cousin to Earth. But you're going to need a while to get there. It's 500 light years away, and given that light travels at 5.88 trillion miles in 1 year, I have no idea how far that is, but it's a heck of a long way away. Any of you who start now will never get there. NASA has named the planet Kepler 186f, and they say its discovery is a significant step toward finding worlds like our planet Earth, But if it's that far away, why find it? But that's where they've got to. And they have called it a habitable zone. Now, I know what a habitable zone is. I live in one and you live in one and we gather together here. But they've called that a habitable zone because it's a closest star, about the right size, the right everything else for sustaining life as we know it without either freezing all of life or frying all of life. And it orbits its star every 130 days. It gets 1/3 of the energy that we get from our sun, which means that at noon it's only about as bright as it is here at sunset. And one of the interesting things, after having put all of that out, the scientists say, we don't know yet if it harbours any life. My answer is, well, why go to all that trouble if that's the conclusion to which you come? Or they say, if it could ever sustain life, since we don't know anything about its atmosphere. One thing, though, and these are the points to note, is that the planet is about the size of Earth. Its mass and composition aren't known, but we understand that its surface is rocky, just like every other planetary body we know, except one particular planet, and that's planet Earth, which is not rocky but 71% water. So the chances for life on that planet are very, very slim indeed. And so if we keep looking for life amongst dead stones and craters in distant worlds, the chances are that we will never find life in those places. As my old late friend Clive used to say, having got us this far, Bruce, when the heck are you going to get on to what we need to hear about today? Well, here we go. The women who came to the tomb early on Easter morning were moving amongst rocks, cold, dead, hard rocks. And they had no illusions that they would find life there at all. Unlike scientists, they weren't hoping for new discoveries. They weren't expecting to find anything that was new. They'd seen death before. They had returned to the tombs many, many times, and every time they returned, they encountered exactly the same thing. It was not a habitable zone, since those who were laid amongst the rocks were always dead. They were always cold. They were always lifeless. And that's why they came with spices that particular morning. I mean, you didn't bring spices to a tomb unless you were expecting to find death amongst the stones. I mean, the whole reason for those Jewish burial rites and burial rites of similar people were that you would anoint the dead body with spices, not just to cut down the smell, but to make the body decompose faster. That's what the spices do. They make the body decompose faster. And then a year later, you come back to the tomb amongst all the rocks and you gather up the bones and you put them in a small box called an ossuary, and then you put the box in a niche in the back of the tomb, and so the same tomb can be used over and over and over again, and the rocks remain completely silent. That morning, these two women came to anoint the body of one whom they thought would bring to them salvation, one whose arrival in Jerusalem they had joined with the crowds and shouted out, "Hosanna, save now." And when Jesus was with them, they felt like almost anything was possible. They had seen people healed from disease. They had seen demons cast out with a word. They had even seen the dead brought back to life. They had heard Jesus talk about the kingdom of God, which sounded to them like a whole new world, sustaining a different kind of life than the life to which they were used to and accustomed to. A world where the first became last. Indeed, where there was no first and there was no last. There was complete indifference to everyone. A world where violence and pain were no more. A world where brokenness and sins of the present and the past were forgiven, and where everything was made new. And the interesting thing for them was it was not some distant world like Kepler 186f. In fact, Jesus said this alien world, this particular world was already breaking in their midst, and indeed, in his very presence, that new world had already arrived. They were already living in a new world. The life, however, having heard all that, had been cut short. Jesus is nailed to a cross as a criminal. He's executed as only revolutionaries and terrorists who threatened the power of the Romans were executed. So it's quite interesting that the one whom we call the Christ was executed as a terrorist. He talked in paradoxical reversals, as if there was another way of understanding life. Paradoxical reversals, the Good Samaritan, the one who is the Jew, the good, comes out as the one who is the bad, and the bad, unacceptable one, the Samaritan, comes out as the good. Who would tell stories in church like that? I would. The women, like so many others, had had their view of the world changed by this one who seemed so alien to them in what he was saying, how he turned everything upside down, and yet, in being so alien, also seemed so totally familiar. But now they'd arrived at the tomb. He was dead, and they'd come to perform all the familiar burial rites. They were absolutely sure that there were no signs of life to be found amongst stones, rocks, and tombs. But when they arrived, as we heard the story, with spices in hand, they found that the stone covering the tomb had been rolled away, and the lifeless body they expected to find inside, the one they would anoint with spices to assist the decomposition, it was gone. What they did find, however, were two men in dazzling white clothes standing beside the tomb, a sight so strange that the women fell to their faces and didn't know what the heck it was all about. And the men say to them the very interesting line, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here." They had expected to find the same old thing, the dead amongst the dead, the stones where they were supposed to be, undisturbed and yielding nothing but cold, dry, geophysical reality. And for us as faithful people, the questions are, why do you seek the living among the dead? If our life as a church is dead, why do you seek the living among the dead? Why are you looking for signs of life in a graveyard? But the story is that the empty tomb sends us in an entirely different direction. For the empty tomb is a sign of life, that something new has broken into our world. St. Paul says that Jesus being raised from the dead signals a new creation, a new galaxy, a new world. It signals the ultimate defeat of anything and everything that brings death to us. And the interesting piece about this is that the kingdom of God is not some distant world, Kepler 186f, but the reality is with us now because heaven and earth have come together. And St. Paul, using his language, talks about first fruits, or we might say that Jesus is the prototype of what hope is for us in God's future. A renewed people in a renewed heaven and a renewed earth. We don't have to look for life out there because it is coming here. And in a sense, that new life is already present and available with us, in us now. The one who was dead is alive, not in the way in which we think somebody has come back to life. The one who was dead is alive in each one of us. We are the risen Jesus. There is no other body called risen Jesus. You and I are the risen Jesus. And because the risen Jesus is alive in us, so we can peer hopefully into the darkness. We have the light of life that illumines everything and makes all things new. Because of this, we who are the risen Jesus see resurrection and life where other people see simply death. The world for us is not a cold, lifeless, rocky place, but it is a world, a place with hope and future. We live and work in the present with the future in mind. We may be reading and thinking about NASA searching for life on worlds that are so far away that it takes us 500 years to get there if we travelled at light speed. But the truth is that the resurrection of Jesus is here today. In we, the community of faith, Jesus is risen. The only evidence, the only proof of the risen Jesus is you. You are the risen Jesus. You might have another name and another address, for sure. But you are the risen Jesus. And without you, there is no resurrection. An incredible thought and plan for us, that we might live and act and be because we are Jesus. Obviously, we're not going to greet each other as "Hello, Jesus," because that would be silly. But the resurrection is us. And I find it fantastic that we can believe, and we do believe, that Jesus has risen because you and I are here.